All right, I think we can get started. It's 12:15. Rob, just a quick check on the slides. Are they showing all right?
Yep, looks good to me.
All right, great. So welcome everyone to the Spinnaker-as-Code SIG update for 2021. We are going to be talking about the stuff that we've done over the past half of the year, actually, since we did one of these late last year, and then give you an overview of the features that have been added to managed delivery in particular over this time, and including kind of a demo. And then at the end, we'll talk about what's coming for the second half of the year. I should say the Spinnaker-as-Code SIG is primarily concerned with enabling users to use Spinnaker with code-based formats, so things like manifest files, templates, etc. And for the past 2 years, we've been focused on managed delivery, like I was saying, which is what we'll be showing today. So if you're unfamiliar with what managed delivery is, we won't really be covering a whole overview of it, but we've done that in previous Spinnaker Summit events, so I encourage you to go check out those materials. All right, so let's get right to it. So what were our highlights for 2021, the first half of the year? We've divided this slide into the stuff that we've done at Netflix and then some of the work that AWS folks have done, because we've been the primary contributors to managed delivery over the last several months. But as we are hoping for at the end of the session, we are definitely always looking for others to be engaged and contribute to evolving it. So the first thing we've improved in these last 2 quarters was our Slack notification story. So now you get really nice Slack notifications pretty much all across your delivery flow, and we're going to take a look at that during the demo as well. We also added a lot of visibility into your code changes, your builds, and the bakes if you're using AMIs that are associated with deployments, such that you don't have to leave the main Spinnaker UI to go find out more details about that. We added support for finding artifacts based on the source control metadata instead of having users worry about versions, which can be very messy and hard for users to reason about. This has been really a nice enabler here at Netflix. We added first-class support for verifications, which is a term we use to describe these post-deployment integration or smoke tests that you run against your live environments using test containers. We've enabled all new Java and Node apps at Netflix to be onboarded to manage delivery by default. They still have a choice to go use pipelines if they want to. And if you're familiar with Spinnaker, which I'm guessing you are since you're here, the classic delivery workflows was using pipelines, and managed delivery in a nutshell is just a way to rethink how you do delivery using a declarative approach. And so all new apps now at Netflix for both those app types are being onboarded by default onto managed delivery. We've also rolled out an entirely new UI. So for those of you who might have seen our presentations in previous events, you'll notice when I do our little demo today that the UI looks much cleaner, and we've refactored it quite a bit based on feedback that we got from our internal users. And then last but not least, I just wanted to point out that we've been seeing huge adoption increase here at Netflix with managed delivery. So in the last quarter, we've actually doubled the number of apps onboarding, and we're really excited about that. I wanted to apologize to our friend Nima Kaviani, who I see is here joining us today in our audience, because I forgot to invite him to co-present this with us. But I'm going to do this on his behalf today. So here's a list of the things that AWS contributed over the last half of the year. They've added support for Kubernetes resources on the UI. And I should prefix this by saying that AWS has been primarily contributing to a plugin for managed delivery that enables Kubernetes resources to be managed via this new paradigm. And they've done a whole lot of work to make that work and turn out into a really nice experience for users. So UI support was a big deal to enable. The next thing they did was to add validation of the Kubernetes resource progression between the environments in the UI. They added the ability to tie Docker artifacts with the deployments into the Kubernetes environments. They also started doing some work on templating tools and working with other partners in the community to think about next steps within the Kubernetes plugins in order to kind of raise the level of abstraction and allow users to not have to worry too much about the details of the Kubernetes resources that are under the hood. And kind of related to this, they did do some work already with Helm and Customize. I believe we have demos of some of these things in our SIG meeting videos, which you're always welcome to check out. There's a link to where you can find all of that material at the end of this presentation as well. All right, so let me go over this little video here that shows you what we've been up to in the last half of the year. So we start with a simple app in Git, and it has this delivery config file, which is the manifest that describes your resources and your delivery workflows. At Netflix, we use Bitbucket, so this is what you're seeing here. And by convention, we store these files under the .netflix directory in a file called spinnaker.yaml. So this is what I'm clicking here. And you can see here, I just highlighted that Netflix, like I mentioned before, we're auto-generating these files doing project scaffolding for Java apps and Node apps, such that users don't have to write all of this YAML by hand, which is an enabler for them to get started. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about this format because we've done that in previous events, as I mentioned, but you can see here that there is a test environment defined, and it's got a few resources, a Titus cluster, which is a Docker cluster, and then a security group. Then we also have a prod environment that has the same resources, and the difference between test and prod is that prod has these constraints, and constraints are just gates that allow you to control how and when your artifacts are going to be promoted into that environment. So for prod, you can see that it has this depends on constraint, meaning that an artifact will only deploy into prod once it's been successfully deployed to test. And then it also has this manual judgment constraint, which I'll show you in a bit here. And what that means is that essentially a human being needs to push a button to approve the deployment into that environment. As I was saying, it has both the same types of resources that are in test, which is pretty common as well. All right, so let's see what this looks like in Spinnaker. First thing I wanted to show you in this new UI is what we call the environments overview page. And this is where you can see your app at a glance and anything and everything that should be important for you to note at any given point in time. So if you're familiar with the Spinnaker UI, there is this new environments tab that shows up on the left-hand side when you have managed delivery enabled. And when you click on that, you land on this overview page, as I was saying. So this gives you a kind of a bird's eye view of your environments and what's going on inside them at that point in time. So it's, as you can see here, it's divided in the environments that you have. So we have a test and a prod environment. And within each, you have the artifacts and the resources, meaning infrastructure resources. Artifacts, to be honest, is more like deployments, if you're familiar with that terminology from, like, say, Kubernetes. So essentially, you'll see like what versions of your artifacts are deployed in each of these environments. Resources, like we were just looking at the config file, you have a security group and a cluster there, so they show up on the UI. The other thing you can do from this view is to see the history of your resources. So there's a little view history link on there next to every resource. And when you click that, this modal pops up where you can see the whole history of your resource. So in this case, the history is relatively short, and it's got like a lot of green events, which is what we want to see generally. But basically, this allows you to see what happened to the resource over time. And for those that have the little expansion icon here, you can also expand and see more details if you want to. Same thing for the cluster resource here. And in this case, you can see there was a warning event in the middle there because I messed up my config. So eventually things resolved. And but anyway, that's how you can see what happened to that resource over time. Next, I wanted to show you the artifact version history page. And this is where you see your code and deploys through time. Essentially, it's a timeline of your delivery flows. So let's take a look at that. It's that second tab on the UI. So when you click that, you can see all of the versions that we know about in Spinnaker, and they are represented in terms of the commits from source control. So that allows you, like I was saying earlier, as a developer or a user to immediately correlate the code that you're working on for your app with what you see here in terms of artifacts and deployments. Each of the bubbles for the environments are color-coded, is color-coded. So gray is for previously deployed, meaning it was deployed at some point, it was replaced. White is for skipped, again, previously deployed. Green is for currently deployed. So in this case, you can see that this second version on the list here is the one currently deployed to prod. And then the very top version is currently deployed to test, and that version is pending for prod right now. The reason it's pending is because there are constraints, like we talked about during the beginning of the demo. So let's talk about these constraints a bit. So when you expand the details there, you can see that it will show you that one constraint at this has passed at this point, and one is still pending. If you expand that, you'll see that the first constraint, which was the prerequisite deployment to test, has succeeded, but that manual judgment that requires a human being to push the button is still pending, and you can see the buttons there to take action and approve or reject. I just went back to the overview to show you that you can do that same thing over on the overview page. And like I said, since this page calls your attention to what needs to be done at any given point in time, this is generally where you'll take action on these. So I'm going to approve this deployment here. And so now both of the constraints are approved. And so eventually things should be deployed there. While that deployment is going, I'm just going to go over some stuff on the UI. So you can also see environments side by side in addition to one on top of the other. This applies on both the overview page and the history page. So I think our users have found this nice because it's easier to see what's common and what's different between the environments, especially if you don't have like a ton of them. Here the deployment started. So while that's going, we're going to take a look at some other stuff as well. I wanted to show you how the system is integrated with the build and source control system. So like I mentioned earlier, every version that we display on the UI is actually tied to a commit. And so as you would expect, these links take you to that commit in the source control system. So here, if I click that link, it's going to take us to Bitbucket again, which is the system we use at Netflix. And you can see exactly what's changed in that version, right? So this is a huge, huge win for our developers, where before this, with pipelines, they used to have to hop from the pipeline, open the stages, find which image was deployed, then go find what builds correlated with that image, and then from there, find the source commit. So here you can see it's just a click away. It's very easy. Same thing for the builds. So you can click on the build number there, and that takes you to this builds page on Spinnaker, which might be new to some of you as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about these three tabs here, but basically we call this the CI view. And so you can see builds, branches, and pull requests on here. And this avoids the need for you to have to like jump over to Jenkins or whatever your CI system is, and you can see everything from one UI. This is also some of the stuff that AWS contributed to making open source recently. So they've rolled out support for Jenkins and GitHub, if I'm not mistaken. You can always click and go see stuff in Jenkins if you want to, or whatever your CI system is. But like I said, the nice thing about this is that you don't really have to. Next is branches. So here you can see basically the branches that we are aware of at this time. So nothing much to say here. And then pull requests. But again, the nice thing is that you don't have to be hopping between different systems. Next, just really quickly, wanted to show you that while managed delivery kind of abstracts away a lot of the details of provisioning infrastructure and all that, you can still drill down into the details if you really want to. So remember I showed you that history view, right? So whenever something is going on with a resource, like in this case, you can see it's saying the resource is being updated. If you click that view history link, you can see that that message about the update has a link to the task as well. So if you click on that, as you might expect, you'll land on the tasks view for that specific task. And here you can see everything, right? You can see all the steps of provisioning the server group in this case. You can click to go see the server group. And on this UI, which is kind of like, let's say, the classic Spinnaker UI, where you see your resources like clusters, load balancers, security groups, etc., you can see that we have a little bit of integration with managed delivery as well in these little light blue icons next to that show up next to the resource names. So from these, you can access similar functionality as I was showing you in the environments view, like the history. The icons also have meaning. So for example, in this case, there was a little gear icon there because the resource was still being updated. When the update finishes, you just go back to this little plain M icon there. If there's anything wrong, you'll get like a yellow or a red icon as well. All right, so here you can see now that we've got both of those versions deployed, right? Great, our artifact is deployed to both test and prod, but what if things will go wrong? So let's just go over a few of the features that we've developed that help you in those cases as well. So just for the sake of the example, let's pretend that I'm adding a cool feature to my app and that I'm really eager to roll it out. So, it's here it's rolled out to test, and then I get trigger happy. I don't really test it well enough, and I go and click on that approve button there to approve the version to go to prod, even though I haven't really done a whole bunch of testing. So let's see what happens there. Cool. So I approved. Eventually, we'll deploy to prod, and we'll get back to that situation where both of the versions, that same version is running on both test and prod, as you can see here. And they're both going to be green on the UI as well. But there is a bug on the feature, right? So then what do we do? The first thing I'm going to show you is this feature called pinning, which is what you use to roll back in managed delivery. Also, I should have said earlier when I was talking about this integration with source control, you can see here on this menu that there are also two links called compare to current version and compare to previous version. What this comparison is about is not like artifact versions, but really the source code that changed between those versions. So this is a huge valuable feature that our users really love. And it allows you to see exactly what changed between one version and the next, or one version and the previous one. So this is a feature that our users use a lot. Here we're going to use this pin version menu, though, to make sure that the previous version that we knew was good in that environment is stays in the prod environment. So here you can add a reason for when you do that. You can use Markdown, you can use emojis. But so we're going to pin that, and then immediately when you do that, there's going to be a warning on the UI saying that even though this version is currently deployed there, a new one is soon going to be deployed because it was pinned. And so eventually you will see that a new version starts deploying there, which is the one we pinned. And while that's going on, I wanted to show you a different feature as well, which is called mark as bad. So what happens here is you're going to say, I want this previous version to be pinned to the prod environment, let's say. But then eventually you're going to want to unpin that version, right, to keep rolling forward. And so if you do that and this version is still around and it happens to be the latest one that's approved, we are still going to pick this up and redeploy it, right? And you don't want that to happen because you know that this version has a bug. So the way that you prevent that from happening is by marking it as bad. So while that's going, I'm going to click on that button there as well, and then mark this version as bad. Similar modal here, so you can type a message, a reason that will display on the UI. You can use emojis. I'm going to mark as bad. So now that version will never ever get deployed into prod again, and it shows on the history page as well here, so you can see that particular version is marked as bad, and eventually the previous one deployed. So you can see here it as green, and it has a little bubble with the pin on top. That we had a little UI bug that I believe has been fixed already. But anyway, there is indication on the UI about both of those states. All right, awesome. So now prod is safe. Let's fix forward, right? And I'm gonna make another PR and fix that. So that's gonna deploy to test as usual. And this time around, we're gonna make sure that we test it really well. And eventually, when things are good, we're gonna want to deploy that fix, right? So here, let's say we've tested the fix and in the test environment, and now we want to approve, right? So we approve it, and what happens next? Will it deploy to prod or not? What happens? So as I was saying earlier, it will not deploy to prod at this point because you still have a pinned version in prod, and that's the previous version that's shown in yellow there. So until you unpin, like I said, the point of pinning, as the name implies, is that it will stick there until you unpin. So in order to allow the new version to roll out, we just unpin. Click that button there. And that should allow that newest version to deploy. All right, while that's going, I wanted to show you notifications really quickly. I know we're spending a whole lot of time here, but let me try to go a little faster. So notifications are also controlled via that config file. For the vast majority of use cases, our users are using Slack. We also support email. But the really nice notifications are via Slack. So this is what I wanted to show you. So here's just showing you how to add those to the delivery config. And once this is parsed by Spinnaker, essentially, we are now going to start notifying you in that Slack channel. So here, I wanted to show you some examples of what that looks like. You can see that there's that new version there. We got picked up as well. It was deployed to test and is currently pending in prod. So let's go take a look at what the notifications look like. So here you can see the notifications. The first one is about a deployment. And the second one is what we call this manual judgment constraint, right? Which is the one that requires approval. You can always click on the links. They're fully integrated, the UI and Slack, to go back and forth. But of course, the whole point of getting those interactive notifications in Slack is that you can just do everything from Slack. So you can just approve from here. And this is pretty handy. We use this all the time with the Spinnaker services themselves here and Netflix. It's very handy. Those reflect on the UI as well, as you would expect. And so, oh, also I had some screenshots of the same notifications on the phone just to show you that you can do the same thing on there. They look pretty beautiful. Cool. So now that we've approved that fix to roll out and have unpinned, that fix rolled out, and then the new one also rolled out. So things are good. All the environments are green, and the clusters lived happily ever after. All right, cool. With that, I'm gonna hand it over to Rob to show you a feature that I missed in this video, which is verifications. Rob, take it away.
Okay. You want to jump on the next slide?
Yes, if I can manage. There you go.
Okay, yeah. So verifications, as Luis said, was just kind of missed out of that video. What verifications gives you is basically the ability to run a container, typically containing like smoke tests or integration tests, against the cluster we just deployed in an environment. So lots of teams at Netflix use this in like a test or staging environment before they go to a production environment, but there's also nothing to prevent you using this directly on your production environment. Because we dog food manage delivery on the project itself, we use a verification that actually creates an application and spins up various resources and makes sure that all the management of those resources is working correctly. And that's run as a container-based test. So what you'll see in the artifact section of the environment view here for a given environment is that, in this case, we are running a verification that's just been launched. It shows you the details of the container it's running and where it's running, how long it's been running for. You've got a link to view the logs of whatever tests are going on there. An improvement we're going to make at some point is to integrate test reporting somewhat better. But right now you can kind of jump to the logs, and you're also able on the platform we use to download the test reports if you do get failures, so you can see exactly what's gone wrong. If you jump onto the next slide, Luis.
Sure.
A verification halts deployment to any environments that are depending on the one that is being verified. So, for example, in this case, we have our staging environment that's depending on our test environment, and things won't start deploying there until that verification is complete. And let's go to the next one. Once complete, we've got some UI notifications there. It's worth pointing out as well that the verifications are also integrated with Slack notifications. So you do get a nice notification of success or failure posted in Slack as well of your verifications. And then as soon as verifications are complete, the depends on constraint will allow deployment to the next environment. Okay, let's jump on to the next one. In terms of improvements to verifications, I think one of the big things we want to do at some point is allowing you to declaratively specify cleanup steps, because right now it's assumed that whatever you're doing in that test container is cleaning up after itself and leaving things in a good state, which, while that's not too unreasonable an expectation for an early version of the feature, I think it can make it difficult to rerun verifications if the tests fail and leave infrastructure floating around in a bad state. It's maybe more of an issue for managed delivery itself than it would be for some systems, but we want to automate the clean or declaratively allow specification of cleanup steps. That's not there yet. It's pretty simple at the moment. In terms of what our plans are for the second half of this year, let's take a look through this list here. We have one thing that's pretty exciting is first-class Git integration. So right now we have people use a traditional Spinnaker pipeline. There's a specific stage type for importing a delivery config. You're not going to have to do that anymore. You'll be able to just point managed delivery directly at your Git repository coordinates, and we'll pick up changes directly from there without using the pipeline. One thing Luis has been working on that's really exciting is preview environments. So what this is for is if you want to deploy a kind of ephemeral environment based on a branch or a pull request in order to do some testing, you'll be able to do that, and managed delivery will handle cleaning up that ephemeral environment after you're done with it. This is something that a lot of people within Netflix, a lot of teams within Netflix are super interested in having, because they do this extensively, especially where they're bringing up entire segmented infrastructure for different applications. Then we have environment versions, which is kind of what I've been busy with recently. What this is planning to do is kind of integrate the changes to your delivery config and the changes to your artifacts into one stream of events, so that you'll be able to promote changes to infrastructure in the same way that you promote changes to the actual deployed artifact on that infrastructure, and apply things like constraints and verifications to rolling out infrastructure changes into environments. Deployment dependencies, this is something we don't support right now, is if you have kind of multiple deployment targets that are to some extent dependent on one another, and you want to pin or roll them back in conjunction with one another. For example, one thing that we see a lot of times is that you'll have your server application, and then you'll want to deploy out a GraphQL schema that's dependent on it. And if one of those fails, the other one really needs to get rolled back at the same time. We want to give you a declarative way to specify those dependencies so that we can do more intelligent behavior right now. Right now, there's nothing to stop you deploying those things, but they'll be completely isolated from one another. Abstracting away security groups and other low-level infrastructure details like load balancers is something that seems very desirable because people don't really like to deal with the details of security groups on EC2. They're pretty complicated, and a lot of typical application developers aren't too concerned with the fine-grained details of those things. So Netflix, in the conjunction of the managed delivery team and our security team, and Netflix is trying to come up with a way that we can declaratively say, oh, I need to expose my application to this other application, or I need to accept traffic from this other application, that kind of thing, rather than having to specify ingress rules and ports and all those kind of fine-grained details. That's going to be pretty big if we can get that right. And last but not least, figuring out how we're going to handle templating. So I mentioned earlier this idea of rolling out infrastructure changes and testing them in the same way that we test changes to the software that's being deployed itself. I think that has maybe somewhat limited utility until we really have an enforced concept of homogeneous environments. So right now, the expectation is that for example, your test staging and production environments look pretty much the same and consist of the same types of resources, but there's nothing actually enforcing that. So if you make a change to your production environment, only is there really much point testing it in the preceding environments if it's only actually going to affect the production environment. So we need to grasp the nettle here and come up with a way of templating things. You can already use, and we do internally use YAML anchors and aliases to do this to some extent, but that only gives you fairly crude control over entire blocks of YAML code that you can kind of reuse in other areas of the file. It doesn't give you the kind of control that the Customize gives you, for example. So that's something we're going to be just exploring what we want our approach to look like. In terms of AWS and their contributions, we're looking at Helm charts and using Git repositories as managed delivery artifacts, supporting using those verifications that I've just showed you with Kubernetes jobs. Internally at Netflix, we use our own container cloud called Titus, and we're running our verification jobs on that. So this will be bringing equal support to regular Kubernetes deployments. Layering and templating strategies. So again, tying into the last point I was making on the Netflix side there, and resource management strategies, which actually, Luis, you may want to explain to me what that is, because I'm not 100% sure.
I also am not 100% sure what Nima meant by that. I wanted to give a shout out to Nima Kaviani again and Manabu McCloskey from AWS, who have been doing a lot of work to both bring managed delivery into open source, make sure that you can install the service backing managed delivery with the rest of Spinnaker with an open source install, and also doing all this feature work to support Kubernetes resources as well. So he provided these bullet points for us to display on the presentation here. I'm not 100% sure what the resource management strategies.
Nima's actually adding a clarification in chat right now. So
I was going to say he's probably going to chime in on the chat. Great. Thanks, Nima. All right. And I think
at that point, we're opening up for Q&A, right?
Yeah, I think so. There you go. So with that, I think we still have a bunch of time for Q&A. I apologize if we went a little fast. I'm glad that this will be recorded so that you can still go back and revisit pieces later at your own leisure if you want to. But let's open for questions. Let's take a look at the Q&A here to see. Yeah, I don't think there's no questions right now. Don't be shy.
Yeah, there was a question earlier about when the new UI enhancements that Luis was showing had hit the code base, and that was within the last month. I'm not 100% sure of exactly where OS open source is with that, because at Netflix we deploy all of our apps straight off the master branch. So I don't personally have any concept of the open source version numbers for Spinnaker, unfortunately. But
so I actually
I think that's pretty soon.
I was just going to say I have an update about that because I just asked Nima before the talk today, and we were trying to get it working last week. So this is very recent, as Rob was saying. We just upstreamed the changes from Netflix that support the backend changes that support the new UI, etc. very recently. And even though the UI changes themselves have been primarily being done on the open source code base, we do need to kind of synchronize the backend and the UI. Again, going back to this idea of dependencies between backend and front end, such that they work together. And so we're currently working through that. My expectation is that maybe within this week or the next week, we might get to a working version. And we'll definitely make a point of noting that to the release manager so that they can add that to the changelog as well.
Okay, we got a question over in the Q&A there about whether it's possible to create Spinnaker pipelines from code rather than via the UI. That's not really the focus of managed delivery. Part of the idea of managed delivery is that we kind of abstract you from the how of your deployments, and you tell us what you want deployed where and what the rules governing that are, as opposed to having to define the steps for getting there. We do have managed pipeline templates, which was a way of kind of templating pipelines for standardization across an organization. I'm not quite up to speed with where the current version of that is, because I know Google was working on it, but I don't know what the state of that is right now. But yeah, it's not something built into managed delivery because we're kind of trying to hide away any pipeline configuration from you. There may be some kind of integration in terms of doing a more complex version of what I showed for verifications with a pipeline, maybe, or for if you have unusual deployment strategies, for example, something that you would model with a custom deployment strategy in regular Spinnaker. We may add some support for that, but that's not concrete on the roadmap right now.
Any other questions? So Tracy had a question on the chat, and I just answered, but just for everyone's awareness, she was asking whether we have a public roadmap tracking the features that we talked about for the second half of 2021. And I was mentioning we used to use one of our GitHub open source projects for that. We haven't in a while, but I am happy to take this suggestion to the managed delivery team here at Netflix to discuss how we can make that process a little bit more transparent.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Thanks. Yeah, by the way, I was going to say, I have a feeling that maybe the folks who've joined us had not had a chance to previously see any material on managed delivery. So if you have any questions on the basics on what are the goals, what are we trying to do, feel free to ask those. It's no problem at all. I'd be happy to take those as well. While we're waiting, I am going to skip this slide to the next one, just so that this one stays on, which has a link.
We just got another question in the chat there, which is, are we using managed delivery in production already at Netflix? And the answer is yes. We managed delivery itself, and most of Spinnaker is deployed using managed delivery. I think the exception in Spinnaker is Cloud Driver, which has some fairly complex deployment pipelines for the way we deploy it within Netflix. And in addition to that, I think today we hit 174 apps in Netflix managed with managed delivery, which is, as Luis mentioned earlier on in the presentation, that's like a 100% growth over the last quarter, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, so 174 apps, and now we're deploying, or we are templating new Node apps and Java apps by default with managed delivery at Netflix.
Which means we expect that curve to keep going up.
Right, yeah. Our support is going to get interesting over the next few months.
It is, yeah. Which is a good problem to have. We're really happy with the adoption curve going that direction. Of course, there's still a ton of room to grow because we have, like, I think in the order of tens of thousands or a few tens of thousands of applications the last time I checked. So there's still...
Yeah, I'm not even sure.
It's crazy, but it's a lot. So there's still a whole lot of room to grow. But this is definitely the vision going forward for how we expect most teams at Netflix to approach their continuous delivery workflows, is to use managed delivery.
Nima was just asking if there's any ETA on versioned environments. Some of the versioned environment stuff is already in the code base under the hood. Most of it's invisible to users, but we are doing some interesting things on the server side to kind of track changes to environments and changes to resources within that environment from version to version. In terms of when it'll be done, I always hate answering this question, but I definitely like by the end of the year. I don't want to promise end of Q3, but
see, Tracy, this is why we don't have a public roadmap.
Right, yeah. Oh, I see there's some more questions on Q&A.
Okay, and we just got a new one on chat as well. Does managed delivery mean that complex Jenkins files no longer have to be created? That is an interesting question. So just to clarify, when you mention Jenkins files, do you mean as in actual Jenkins files used to create Jenkins pipelines? Because okay, thanks for clarifying. That's a very good question. So I guess if you or your company are using Jenkins files today to create pipelines that include the deployment step of your delivery workflow, in addition to just like the build and like unit test steps, then a piece of that pipeline would be replaced by what managed delivery does. So our contract starts with a published artifact. This is what we kind of listen to, right? Managed delivery is constantly monitoring the artifact repositories based on what you specify on that declarative config file. And whenever we detect a new one is when everything that we showed you in the demo kicks off. So like deploying a new version, etc., evaluating if it's ready to be deployed, etc.
In terms of what we do, we're using Jenkins for CI only.
For CI only.
Managed delivery does everything else. Yeah.
Right. So that's what I mentioned, that if you're using Jenkins to do CI and CD both in a pipeline, which is, I know, a common pattern in the industry, something that I used to do in a previous job, then you would replace like half of that pipeline, let's say, with managed delivery. You wouldn't have to worry about the deployment part. This kind of goes back into the basics and the benefits of managed delivery. One interesting thing that I may not have conveyed very clearly just with that demo today is that the difference between something like a pipeline, which is also the concept that we support in, let's say, classic Spinnaker, and managed delivery, is that with a pipeline, if something fails during that particular execution of the pipeline to deploy your build, then you get an error and you have to like manually retry, or you have to add your own automation on top of the pipelines to automatically retry periodically, etc. Right? You generally need to dig in to figure out what was wrong, to decide what to do. And with managed delivery, we drive every action based on that declarative state that you specify in your config file, which we call the desired state of your application. And so managed delivery is essentially, in a nutshell, a whole bunch of monitoring loops that constantly look at the state of the world as it exists today and compares that with the state that you declared in your file to see if the two match. And if they don't match, then we take action to correct it. And that in turn gives us like natural resilience to these temporary failures, for example. So let's say AWS had a glitch in one of the services, and when deploying an EC2 instance, your pipeline failed. Well, like I said, you need to wait for AWS to recover and then eventually trigger that pipeline again. With managed delivery, you don't have to do that because we'll automatically retry periodically and let you know what's going on in that history of the resource on the UI. Hope that
We've got
helps.
a couple of other questions over in the Q&A now that I just want to address quickly.
Sure.
How do different deployment strategies like canary deployment fit into managed delivery? So canaries are available as a constraint on an environment. So for example, that can mean that you run a canary much as you would in a pipeline before deployment is allowed to go to a particular environment. We also have support for various different deployment strategies, the types of ones that you have in Spinnaker pipelines. So Highlander and Red Black, or which most of the rest of the world calls blue green. For some reason, Netflix calls it red black. And we just added support for rolling push very recently. We don't yet have support for custom deployment strategies, and I'm not exactly sure what the plan around that is or what it will look like, but at some point we'll address that. Yeah, so canaries are supported right now. Another question is there any governance layer that admins can specify or manage to allow, for example, to allow certain types of resources and other restrictions? That's an interesting one because, yeah, Netflix is so kind of freedom and responsibility driven that we tend to allow most people to do anything. One thing that is worth pointing out is that, you know, your configuration for resources and infrastructure is typically stored alongside of your code in the Git repository. So only people who have commit rights to that repository can make changes to that configuration. And Spinnaker also takes actions using an authority that is specified in that managed delivery configuration. So you can lock down, you know, for example, we have our AWS accounts locked down so that only certain users with certain roles can take actions in those accounts, and that managed delivery supports that authentication model. In terms of like anything beyond that, I suspect that's something that you would need to look at open source contributions for, because that's probably not something Netflix would pursue. But yeah, Git an account authentication is already supported.
I was just going to add that I think that sounds like a really interesting topic for the SIG meeting. So please, we just drop a link on the chat there because the slides are actually not attached to this talk today. But please do join us. It's open for anyone to join. The document is open for editing with the agenda. So you can just throw in your suggested topics on there. Join us on our bi-weekly call, and we'd be super happy to have you over. I wanted to mention on the canary question that we did have a presentation from our resilience team recently at the SIG meeting, going over this plugin that they developed for managed delivery internally at Netflix, and that leverages the latest and greatest canary solution here at Netflix, which unfortunately is not fully open source at this stage. And so that particular implementation is not currently available, but I think it's still a useful presentation to look at just to see what's possible and maybe get some ideas about what could be done in open source as well. Julia asks, where can we find the link to the presentation? That is a good question. I will need to relay that to one of the organizers.
Yeah, because I think they said that these BOF sessions are not going onto YouTube, so, but I'm sure we can figure out a way to make it available somehow.
Yeah, I can see it's being recorded, so I'm hoping they're going to be made available somewhere.
Any plans to include pipeline as code similarly to Canary? I'm not sure. It's not something our team directly is working on right now. Luis, do you know where some of the other folks in our org are with that?
That's funny that question popped up, because we just had the same question pop up this week when I was on call for support by one of our users. And essentially, I think what we narrowed the request down to would be a constraint that can call, sorry, not a constraint. It was a custom deployment strategy, which you were talking about earlier, Rob, that would basically use a pipeline under the covers, and that could then do anything you needed really to decide when it's okay to do a deployment or not. So that feature request has not been prioritized yet. We are just about to get started on our Q3 planning here at Netflix, but it's something to watch out for. So again, if there's more users asking for that feature, even if it's from open source, it might kind of climb the ladder of priorities. I can't say right now. Is it something that can be versioned and stored in Bitbucket or GitHub? Can you clarify, Nabil, what you mean by versioned? What exactly are you asking?
I think
could be versioned.
I believe he just means that the pipeline configuration would be able to be stored, much like the managed delivery configuration is right now.
Yeah. Again, that's an implementation detail that I don't have an answer for right now. I assume that if and when we get to planning out to implement that feature, then we get into the details. I remember when we had this discussion internally, though, the immediate kind of like low-hanging fruit way to approach this would be to have the user still configure the pipeline on the UI using the Spinnaker UI, since that's a fairly easy experience, better than writing a ton of code for pipelines, and then just provide the ID in the config as code for managed delivery, even though obviously that kind of takes away from the whole as code experience, because you ideally keep everything as code. So again, it can't say at the moment which way we're going to go if we end up implementing that.
And also, yeah, putting IDs into the managed delivery configuration is something we've really tried hard to avoid. So, for example, anytime you're referring to like an account or a region or a VPC or anything like that, we always try and have it as user-friendly as possible and have you enter the name of something. But that's tricky with pipelines because they don't have to be unique, and and they can be changed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I believe that when the resilience team did their demo of the managed Canary plugin at the SIG, they were still using IDs for the Canary experiments. It's just not a great example of what you were just saying.
Right.
I don't know if that's been abstracted away yet, but yeah, to Rob's point, whenever we can, we try to remove the need for you to know the nitty-gritty details of things, including IDs. We got an update from Marcel on there saying that from different events, he's seen that the session links have been posted to the schedule afterwards. I believe that's the case with Spinnaker Summit as well. So yeah, if you're looking for the recording notes or any associated materials from this, I would encourage you to check back on the main website and the schedule afterwards. If you join our SIG Slack channel, hint, hint, I'll be happy to provide updates over there as well.
And we do record those sessions and make them available afterward as well. So
that's right. All right.
I think we're coming up on time, right?
Down. Yeah. Thank you all very much for joining. Thanks for your time. We appreciate it. And looking forward to connecting more in the Spinnaker-as-Code SIG or any of the open source communities around Spinnaker. See you next time.
Yeah, or the Slack channel is always there if you want to ask us questions about anything.
There you go. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, folks.